Before I begin this sermon, I just want to thank Carmen in particular for inviting me to come to Womankind and all the women who organized this amazing festival of women. And I want to thank Randy for letting all those women go wild. I met Carmen in 2007 at Yale Divinity School, and I just want to say she was really impressive then, but now she's really something. I want to start with a little snippet of a poem by W.H. Auden. It's about a painting that Bruegel did of Icarus falling into the sea. And the amazing thing about this painting, which some of you I'm sure have seen, is that there's all this stuff going on in the foreground of the painting. And way off in the right-hand corner, there are these little white legs falling into the sea, right next to a beautiful ship. And Auden says, about suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking dully along. At the end of November 2009, I was building a fire in my house in Santa Barbara, and I noticed a blur at the edge of my right eye. It was as if I'd caught a ghost walking out of the room. I put off going to the doctor for a couple of weeks. And when I finally did, he looked through his scope at my right eye and he said, "Darn." And I thought, I've never heard a doctor say that. He said, "Your right optic nerve is inflamed. And if you don't get steroids right away, you will lose your sight." Well, in that moment, I dropped out of the world I had lived in, where I thought I knew about disease and vulnerability and mortality and all that, and into another country. It was not like another place. It was another country. I ended up calling it Oz. That first day, I walked from his office to the emergency room. And on the street, there were doctors in white coats walking briskly, and a woman eating a sandwich, and people talking on their cell phones, and kids on skateboards. And I felt as if a glass wall had fallen between me and them. There they were, going about their lives, seemingly oblivious to how close illness is, and oblivious, it seemed, to the health of their own bodies. And there I was, no longer oblivious, no longer purposeful, carrying my eyes. I'm a middle-class professional, like many of you. And before that visit to the doctor, I thought I could manage just about anything. But when that happened, I had what I call a break in the narrative. Before my nerve was inflamed, my narrative had been, put very simply, onward and upward. I suspect that many of you share this narrative. We all do. A break in that narrative can be caused by a sudden illness, a death, the loss of a job. And I write an illness, a death, the loss of a job as if they were just words. But we know what they mean. A descent, a separation, a snapping break. And suddenly, the world is going on, and you are not. Illness really has a scalding power. It sweeps aside the life that was and what coping mechanisms you thought you had. And that first night, I discovered that I did not know how to pray. I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to prayer. I really didn't think I would need to. And that night, I had in my toolbox what I call the 9/11 prayer, which is basically, help me, make this go away. And that prayer, I think, was directed to a God not far from the old pictures of a bearded man in heaven, the one who fixes things, like a puppet master pulling the strings, the sovereign God, who is perfect and powerful and distant from us. A God who, in some traditions at least, presents challenges like an illness to grow and test our faith. Well, the gospel today hints at a different God. And as my illness wore on, I found that different God in pieces, in fragments, in the spaces in between. Jesus tells us in this gospel that we are as valuable and priceless as salt, and that we are the light by which others see. You are salt. You are light. The emphasis is not on God, the big guy in heaven, but us, our priceless value. Without us, food is without flavor. Without us, others cannot see. When my husband and I finally made our way to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, the place for many of last resort, the whole town felt like Oz. But there was no glass wall between residents here. We were all in this together. As people left an elevator, they often turned and said, "Good luck." And pretty soon, we said it too. One morning, I had a bronchoscopy at Mayo, and afterward, the nurse told me I had to sit in a wheelchair for the return to our hotel room. And so my husband wheeled me out of pulmonary and into an elevator and out onto the main floor. And I saw a little girl ahead of us in a wheelchair, pulling herself expertly along. Well, most of my life, I have not known what to say or do around people in wheelchairs. They lived in another country, one place I'd never be. I nodded and said hello, and then looked away. But this time, as we pulled alongside her, I looked over and I said, "Hi." And she looked at me with a full, open smile, and she said, "Hi." And there we were, momentary companions on this particular road in our own country, no wall. And the cord between us was our mutual vulnerability. Vulnerability. In a knight's armor, there are things called interstices, the places armored plates could not cover: the armpit, the knees, the elbows, at the hips. Interstices are also defined as the spaces between objects, or even between atoms in a crystal. An interstice can be a small interval of time, free to be spent on activities other than one's primary goal, or even a fragment of space. When you are not fully armored, you are vulnerable. In an interstice, in a fragment of space, like the space between plates in armor, lies vulnerability. Well, we are trained to cover up those spaces, to recover our productive lives and get that armor back in place. But what if, for today at least, we imagine that the salt to which Jesus refers is what each of us found when the armor went down, and something got in through the spaces in between. What we made of it, what it made of us. Or even if we learned nothing or can't articulate what we made of those moments, I propose that we just give those spaces and that vulnerability and those times dignity. A woman whose daughter, for the moment, can't speak because her vocal cords are paralyzed, wrote to me and said, "Your story helped me claim a reality as authentic and real, not just a slightly tarnished or distorted lens of the healthy world." And a guy wrote to me on Facebook who shares my particular disease, and he said, "I've had this overwhelming empathy with folks that I treated with benign neglect in my pre-Oz days." Well, these two people sent me salt and light. Before I got sick, I treated people who were sick with benign neglect and a minimum of sympathy, and then I moved on. Because it was never going to happen to me. I gave people advice that they didn't need and wasn't worth very much because I didn't know what I was talking about. And the God I prayed to then was very much an onward and upward sort of guy. And I didn't check in with him very often because things were going just fine. Well, Jesus in this gospel hints not of a distant, perfect God, not a God of triumph and success, He speaks of a God for whom our imperfections and tragedies are not problems to be fixed, nor obstacles to test our faith. Instead, Jesus speaks of a God who sees these very imperfections and tragedies as openings, as places of salt and light. And what counted for me in Oz was a Jesus and a God who lives inside vulnerability, in the spaces in between. The vulnerability narrative replaced my onward and upward narrative. And the God I prayed to and pray with was a God who did not make it all go away, but who is there, inside the suffering, and unafraid of the suffering. Only a suffering God, said Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he knew what he was talking about. Only a suffering God can save. And this is a God now who does not so much lead me as accompany me. Well, at one point in my medical saga, a doctor asked me, "What happened to you in the emergency room?" And he said, "I used to get full reports on patients in the emergency room, and now what I get are the results of tests." And he said, I think that medicine has lost a narrative. And I will wager you today, or just suggest to you today, that maybe we Christians have lost a narrative, or better to say, we have obscured it. We have obscured the vulnerable Jesus who sits at the center of Christianity and replaced him sometimes with someone else. A triumphant God, Jesus as King. This is a lot like, to my ears now, the narrative of Onward and Upward. When I looked over at the girl in the wheelchair at the Mayo Clinic, and she looked at me, I had the sense that there was a third person there. He was there because she was there, and I was there. And a very fragile line connected the three of us. Whoever this man was, who lived and died and lived again, was there. Not literal, not visible, but not absent, not without influence, and certainly not dead. The resurrection, when looked at this way, is not a magic act, but is instead a revelation of what stays alive and what does not. Love and its close cousin, vulnerability, the salt and the light stay alive. And the rest, the other narratives, clanging cymbals, sounding brass. We human beings are standing in a circle holding each other up, sharing our salt and light. With us is a low vulnerable God who can't stop himself or herself from sharing our condition and eating up our stories. A God who, when disaster befalls us, when we are in danger of losing our sight, when the doctor says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more I can do," that is when this God stretches out his hand. I have been there, this God says, and I will accompany you all the way. It's the nature of things to be vulnerable. The disorder is imagining that we are not. Amen.